Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the History Archive by Noah Bayer, a history podcast where I talk about all sorts of themes out of recent history and how they shaped our current world. It has been a somewhat longer summer break. I would like to apologize for that, but in the summer months I haven't been able to work as much on the podcast as I would have liked, but now we are back with the final two episodes of the season, releasing for you today on the 15th of September, and then the final episode of the season will be releasing on the 31st of September. Okay, today we will be talking about naval technology and naval engagements in World War I. And to give you a little bit of historic context, we will start in 1869, when the Second German Empire was founded. In 1888, then the young and aspiring William II came to the German throne and became the German Emperor. He was related to the House of Windsor, and he was always fascinated by the British Empire and wanted to have an empire of similar strength. And he was a special admirer of the Royal Navy, and just for having a navy, he desperately wanted a navy because he admired the Royal Navy. And of course, if you want to have a world empire, you also need a navy to patrol the waters off the coast of the colonies and also bring soldiers to and fro and things like that. Of course, the same applied to the British Empire, which was already in position, and they, of course, have been holding an impressive navy and were respected in the world for their navy. At the latest since the victory at Trafalgar by Lord Nelson in 1805 during the Napoleonic Wars. But for this story, we will be focusing mainly on a very specific part of naval technology which came into play in 1916. The then First Sea Lord, Lord Jackie Fisher of Kilverstone, would witness the launch of a truly revolutionary ship, which was in large parts his idea. His idea was an all-big gun battleship. It was christened after his family motto. It was called the HMS Dreadnought. The ship was revolutionary in mainly three regards. The already mentioned all-big gun layout. This meant that resources on the ship would be concentrated towards the main armament and would have very little secondary armament. This meant that all the main guns on the ship would be of the same caliber. Earlier dreadnoughts would have 12-inch guns. Later on, during the era of the so-called super dreadnoughts, which were in further development of the dreadnought, they would be carrying 15 or even 16-inch guns. This was one of the developments. A second was that instead of using steam pistons to propel the ship forward, the much more effective steam turbines would be used to generate higher speeds. And the third aspect is the heavy armor, which would contribute to help the ship stay afloat even if it is being pounded by enemy shells. This also includes a watertight compartmentalization in the entire ship. So the entire ship is honeycombed, and the single sections of the ship are separated from each other by watertight bulkheads, so that if one section is flooded, the water doesn't spread out to the adjacent sections and keeps the ship afloat. Ships that aligned in one or the other way with these three design principles were generally called dreadnoughts, after the HMS Dreadnought, and I will be referring to them as such in the course of the episode. The German Kaiser also desperately wanted dreadnoughts. He He told his people that the future of Germany lies on the seas. And thus a sort of arms race began across the North Sea, with the British and the Germans both building dreadnought-type battleships and battlecruisers. The task of building the World Navy for Germany, with modern dreadnoughts as its core, fell to the fork-bearded Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. In Britain, this job came to Jackie Fisher, whom I have already previously mentioned as the inventor of the dreadnought. Both men had quite different design philosophies when it came to building dreadnoughts. Tirpitz was absolutely convinced that a battleship's or a dreadnought's main objective should be to stay afloat and keep fighting even when being hit hard by enemy shells, torpedoes and mines. This was reflected heavily in the design of German dreadnoughts. They were typically slower and had smaller guns than their British counterparts, but they more than made up for it with their heavy armor. Also, the bulkheaded compartments were smaller, so that one flooded section wouldn't be too bad. Fisher was convinced of basically the exact opposite, that it was of vital importance that a battleship or battlecruiser could dictate the perimeters of a naval engagement. This would be done by mainly two factors. On the one hand, by superior speed, so that one could dictate when and where the battle would take place. And the other thing was that the gun ranges would be greater, so the British ships would just have larger guns than the Germans, so that they could engage earlier and engage the enemy with force. This, of course, meant that there had to be sacrifices on the end of armor. And we will see which of these two design philosophies would prevail along the line of naval engagements during World War I. To make sure that we are all on the same page when I launch into explanation of various naval engagements during the First World War, here is a little warship terminology for you. So we've already talked about dreadnoughts. This includes the main battleship, which strikes a balance between heavy armor, high speed and big guns, as we already saw on different scales. The battlecruiser is also fitted with large caliber guns and are faster, and therefore on both sides make sacrifices for their armor. The German battlecruisers were nonetheless also armored with thicker armor plating than the British, so the British battlecruisers were also faster than the German battlecruisers, just like the battleships on the British side were somewhat faster than the Germans. But of course, the sacrifices were made in the armor plating. Below these two kinds of ships, the battlecruiser and the battleship, both dreadnought type ships, come somewhat more insignificant ships, if you will. There is the armored cruiser, which is the predecessor of the battlecruiser. It is specialized in heavy armor, it is slower, and it has smaller guns. And then there are the light cruisers, which are very fast, but they are armored only with very thin armor plating and only have very small caliber guns. They are mainly scouting vessels. Destroyers are also used for scouting missions and screening of larger fleets, so they travel in front of the main part of the fleet and give early warning of enemy ships oncoming. But destroyers also have the capability to launch torpedoes, which can be quite deadly. Light cruisers and destroyers are also often referred to together as light forces in general. So in 1915, 1 year after the beginning of the war, the German Admiral Franz Hipper, in command of the German battlecruiser fleet, was beginning to be very suspicious about British fishing trawlers on the Dogger Bank. The Dogger Bank is a relatively flat area in the middle of the North Sea. It is also quite large, and importantly, it is quite a popular fishing ground with British fishers and also of other adjacent nations. So the Admiral Franz Hipper of the Germans was beginning to be suspicious about the fishing trawlers. Why? Well, the British Admiralty, or the British Fleet, which is also referred to as the Grand Fleet, always seemed to be suspiciously well informed about the position of German ships. Hipper's suspicion was that the fishing trawlers were giving the Admiralty in London information about German ship movements in the North Sea. This was, however, a false assumption. There was a team of code breakers at the Admiralty in London, and they were intercepting German wireless transmissions. They, of course, were coded. But over the course of the First War year, British intelligence had found 3 separate code books which were used to cipher important information for the naval war. But not only could the Admiralty now read the messages that the Germans were sending each other on the sea, they could also, through directional radio stations, locate the German ships. So 2 directional radio stations would pick up the bearing from which the signal was coming, so more or less the angle at which the radio signal was incoming, and if 2 stations combine, they can triangulate the position of the radio signal. And if you take successive positions from one ship with using the same call sign, in the day every ship sending wireless messages was using call signs, you could find out the course of the enemy ship. This is, of course, very useful if you know when and where your enemy is going to be, and also where they are currently. Hipper, of course, did not know this, so he had a plan. He wanted to, first of all, conduct an offensive sweep with his battlecruisers and destroy as many light forces as he could find at the Dogger Bank, and also on his way back to base, he would search every single fishing trawler that he encountered, make sure of their identities, and make sure that they were not spy ships, and if he found any spies reporting information to London, he would incarcerate them. Hipper took his three of his battlecruisers, SMS Seydlitz, SMS Moltke, and SMS Derflinger, and the modern armored cruiser SMS Blücher. His plan to sweep the Dogger Bank and try to find spy ships in the North Sea backfired, however, as the Admiralty knew in advance about their coming. So the Admiralty scrambled the British battlecruisers under command of Vice Admiral David Beatty to attack the inferior force coming out into the middle of the North Sea without any support of the German high seas fleet. Beatty took with him 5 battlecruisers: HMS Indomitable, HMS New Zealand, HMS Lion, the flagship, HMS Princess Royal, and HMS Tiger. The latter 3, Princess Royal, Tiger, and Lion, being the 3 most modern battlecruisers in Britain. The British ships were not only superior in number, but also the armored cruiser Blücher hopelessly inferior to its British counterparts, so it should be an easy game for the British. The 2 fleets met on the Dogger Bank. Beatty's ships opened fire first on the escaping German ships who were trying to scramble back home, but could not avoid engagement due to their inferior speed. Beatty caught up to them and opened fire at a range of 20,000 yards, which is equivalent to 18 kilometers. The Germans could not fire back at this range because their guns did not have the equivalent range. Soon the British ships were scoring hits on the armored cruiser Blücher in the rear of the German formation. Also, a shell from HMS Lion hit the after gun turret of SMS Seydlitz, which almost caused the entire ship to explode. Why would an entire ship explode from a single shell hit on a turret? Well, the gun turrets are big rotating cages in the hull of the ship. On the top of the gun turret are usually 2 guns. Later on, with very advanced super dreadnoughts, one might find 3, as on Bismarck in World War II. But in this case, it was twin turrets, so you have 2 guns, and gun crews in the top of the turrets put kegs of blast powder and the actual shell in the breech, and then they close the shell and the gun is fired remotely. The only problem is that you have to get the kegs and the shells from the magazine, which is in the very bowels of the ship. So if you hit the turret and it is blasted open and a fire starts, the fire can rapidly develop downwards from the top of the turret down into the magazine, where all the powder kegs are stored. And if all of those kegs go off simultaneously or in short succession, the ship will be pulverized to absolutely nothing. Only through the absolute last second flooding of the magazine was this catastrophe averted. Nevertheless, several gun turrets on Seydlitz were out of action. So the situation was looking badly for the Germans. Seydlitz had lost several gun turrets and Blücher was suffering badly from British shellfire. But by now the German guns were also in range of the British ships and they were starting to fire back. German fire was much more effective and accurate that day. Soon, all ships were concentrating on HMS Lion, the flagship of the British fleet. Due to the damage inflicted, Lion was beginning to fall out of line and lose speed. Just as HMS Tiger, one ship behind Lion, was beginning to overtake, Beatty signaled to turn straight away from the pursuit. Why would he do that? The enemy was almost in his claws, and help from the German high seas fleet was still quite far away. Well, Beatty thought that he had seen a periscope. He knew that it couldn't be any of his submarines, so he suspected a German submarine. Out of fear that he might have run right into a German submarine mine trap, he turned away with his battle cruisers, losing vital ground to the escaping German ships. Due to this loss of space, the 3 German battle cruisers, Seydlitz, Moltke and Derfflinger, managed to get away. But the out-of-date armoured cruiser Blücher was left behind, shot up so badly by British shellfire that she was almost completely unmaneuverable and had lost speed. The British ships turned away from the pursuit, realizing that they would not be able to catch the German ships in time anymore before they would be running right into waters they knew to be mined by the Germans. Beatty did not want to risk his ships, so he turned back and sunk SMS Blücher. The battle is considered a disappointing victory for the British. It seems to demonstrate that longer gun ranges and greater speed seemed to prevail over heavier armor. As the Germans were forced to engage when they couldn't escape the oncoming British ships, they were exposed to gunfire before their guns were in range. Back in London, Admiral Jackie Fisher believed that his theory for greater gun ranges and higher speed in sacrifice of heavy armor seem to have been proven right. At the beginning of the war, the High Seas Fleet was numerically inferior to the Grand Fleet in Britain. This was mainly due to the fact that Great Britain did not need to invest a lot of money and resources into their army as an island nation. Thus it was possible to invest a vast amount of money and resources into the navy. The same could not be said for the German military spendings. They had to split their money between an army that would have to fight on the eastern and western fronts simultaneously, and a navy that would have to somehow contend with the mighty Grand Fleet. So, as the Kaiser Wilhelm II was afraid of losing his prized fleet of dreadnoughts to the superior Grand Fleet, he forbade the dreadnoughts to come out of the berth of Helgoland, which is the last German island before you get into the high seas of the North Sea. So for the first 2 years of the war, the Germans tried to whittle down the superiority of the Grand Fleet by using more sophisticated means than engaging them in a full-out battle. The plan was mainly to use mines and submarines to try to whittle down the number of the Grand Fleet. And in fact, some small triumphs were achieved. For instance, relatively early on in the war, a mine sunk the British dreadnought HMS Audacious. But these methods were not didn't suffice to bring down the numbers of the Grand Fleet far enough to risk a head-to-head battle. And the main problem with this was that right at the beginning of the war, the British had established a far blockade. Not as the Germans had suspected, directly in the berth of Helgoland, but between the Orkney Islands and Norway, far in the most northern parts of the North Sea. This blockade line was held mainly by outdated cruisers, but the main bulk of the Grand Fleet had its base not very far away from the blockade line. So if the German High Seas Fleet came out all the way to the Orkney Islands or Norway to try to attack the blockade line, it would be easy for the entire Grand Fleet to come out and destroy the High Seas Fleet in the middle of the North Sea, far away from friendly minefields. This was the reason why the Germans tried to whittle down the numbers of the Grand Fleet so far that they could come out in a full engagement to try to challenge the supremacy of the British side over the North Sea, so that one could destroy the blockade line and get resources that were vital to the German war effort. So in 1916, the war was going badly for Germany. There were various problems with the food supply in Germany through the blockade, and the army wasn't getting the vital resources as shells and similar necessary weaponry at the Western Front. So the newly appointed Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Reinhard Scheer, proposed a risky plan to kick off a campaign to seriously bring down the numbers of the Grand Fleet so that at some point a full-out battle could be risked to try to destroy the Grand Fleet, and as such then destroy the blockade and finally bring back vital resources to the army in France. The plan looked as follows. Hipper would once again come out with his battle cruisers, this time in greater numbers than at the Battle of the Dogger Bank, along the Danish coastline, along the coast of Jutland. The entire High Seas Fleet would be following behind. The British would jump and send out David Beatty to try to, with his superior battle cruisers, hunt down the German battle cruisers. But the point of the plan was that German U-boats would be stationed right outside the base of the battle cruisers, which is somewhat more to the south than the main Grand Fleet base at Scapa Flow, which is near the Orkney Islands. The battle cruisers were stationed more southerly, and as such would be able to come out faster, so the Admiralty would prefer to bring out the battle cruisers so they could engage the small, in quotations, German fleet of Jutland. But the submarines would then sink as many battle cruisers as possible when they sortied out of their base, and the remaining battle cruisers would then run right into the arms of not only Admiral Hipper but also the entire high seas fleet. This, in the mind of Admiral Reinhard Scheer, would absolutely obliterate all British battlecruiser forces, which would be a decisive step in the right direction for the Germans. However, through their code breakers, the Admiralty knew about the plan. By the way, the code breakers also had the nickname Room 40, as the initial team had worked in Room 40 of the old Admiralty. So, now warned, the Admiralty brought out not only the battle cruisers under the command of David Beatty, but the entire Grand Fleet to commit to fighting the high seas fleet off the coast of Jutland. The ensuing battle off the coast of Jutland is probably one of the most indecisive naval battles in history. The British lost more lives and more ships than the Germans, but the Germans were denied what they had wanted, which was the serious dent in the numerical superiority over the high seas fleet. This was not achieved. The main technical takeaways, or the main engineering takeaways, occurred in the first phase of the battle, when the two battlecruiser fleets met. Again, the British battlecruisers were under command of Vice Admiral David Beatty, and the German battlecruisers were under command of Admiral Franz Hipper. Beatty found himself in a similar situation as on the Dogger Bank. He was in range of the Germans, but the Germans were not in range of shooting at the British. However, Beatty delayed opening fire until the German guns were also in striking range. When he opened fire, the British ships were firing extremely imprecisely at the German ships. The Germans, however, were firing as precisely as ever. And with their extremely precise fire, they managed to sink the two British battlecruisers HMS Indefatigable and HMS Queen Mary, due to the lack of armor on their gun turrets, which led to the magazines of the two ships exploding, what I described earlier. Even though there were so-called anti-flash doors to prevent fires from spreading from the gun turrets to the magazines. Well, why didn't these anti-flash doors prevent the ships from exploding? Well, it was common practice on capital ships to jam open the anti-flash doors permanently so as to move munitions faster from magazine to turret. The Germans had learned their lesson after SMS Seydlitz almost blew up on the Battle of the Dogger Bank, and introduced rigorous schemes to make quite sure that German ships would not blow up. The British did not have this experience and believed that their ships were safe. They had to learn a brutal lesson at Jutland that this was not the case, as after Indefatigable and Queen Mary went down, HMS Invincible was lost in the same way, to a magazine explosion. German battlecruisers were also hit hard, especially in the second part of the battle, when Commander-in-Chief of the British Grand Fleet, Admiral John Jellicoe, with the entire Grand Fleet of dreadnoughts with him, opened fire at the battle cruisers. They were taking on severe amounts of water. However, their compartmentalization made it possible for them to stay afloat and limp back home, all except one ship, which was struck so badly by British shell fire that it sank. The ship in question was SMS Lützow. She had to be abandoned at the end of the battle by her crew as she was taking on too much water. Also, other German main battleship dreadnoughts, had taken severe damage by the fire from the main battleship dreadnoughts from under command of Jellicoe, but they managed to stay afloat as well. The main bulk of the dreadnought battleships in the British fleet remained almost entirely undamaged, as they managed to keep their distance and outmaneuver the German high seas fleet in the latter part of the battle. Admiral Scheer had to recognize at the end of the first day of fighting that it was crucial to escape back to Wilhelmshaven, otherwise he knew that his fleet would be annihilated. He managed to scramble back home under the loss of several lighter forces and the outdated pre-dreadnought SMS Pommern. So I have to come to the conclusion that there is no truly superior way of building a dreadnought battlecruiser or dreadnought battleship. Both philosophies have their severe pros and cons, and both designs had their moments to shine during the war. But the naval war across the North Sea was not decided by the superior design. It was decided by the superior numbers of the British fleet. And maybe if the battleships and battle cruisers had been handled in a better way on either side, maybe they could have been used to more potential. Both sides made mistakes along the road. In both the battle at the Dogger Bank and at Jutland, both sides made mistakes which make dents in the performance of their war machines. So in the end, it's always humans controlling the ships. So it isn't so easy to discern which design is superior to the other. And of course, the sheer numeric superiority of the Grand Fleet also really warps the view of what happened in the naval engagement towards the British side. As the Germans were not able to break the superiority of the British Grand Fleet on the North Sea, they could not break open the blockade. So they resorted to another method, which was the unrestricted submarine warfare. They tried in turn to create a blockade line with their submarines outside of the British Islands to try to choke out their war effort as the British were choking out the German war effort. This did not have success, and I outlined this process in the first ever episode of the History Archive. You can go listen to it right now if you want to get a little bit more details on that. So for the rest of the war, basically, except for a few smaller skirmishes, the mighty high seas fleet, the valued prize of Kaiser Wilhelm II, remained at their bases in Wilhelmshaven until the war ended in November of 1918. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the History Archive. If you want, you can subscribe on the podcast platform where you are listening to this, or if you are listening to this on YouTube, you can also like and subscribe. And if you have criticism, ideas, or anything I should know, you can leave me a comment on YouTube or on the podcasting platform where you are listening to this, or you can write me an email to noah.bayer.podcast@gmail.com. All the contact info is of course also in the show notes, just like the sources that I used for today's podcast. And as always, I would like to recommend you a book. Normally I do this at the beginning of the episode, but today I pushed it to the end. Most of my information I took from the wonderful book from Robert K. Massey, Castles of Steel, Britain, Germany, and the Winning of the Great War at Sea. It is quite a long book, but it gives you a lot of in-depth analysis of the naval policies and that led up to World War One, and also an in-depth analysis of every battle every significant naval battle that took place during the war, including ones that I wasn't able to cover in today's episode, such as the Battle of the Berth or the Battle of the Falkland Islands. So if you are interested, I will of course also have a link in the show notes. So I hope that you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and I hope that we hear each other again on the next episode of the History Archive. My name is Noah Bayer. Bye.